Civilization came late to Europe. It remained a backwater of small farming communities and local chiefdoms. But the 1,000 years before Christ saw a great increase in the population of Northern Europe, and large areas of land came into cultivation for the first time. Local expansion brought about movements of population into hitherto sparsely inhabited regions. It was in this era that the first flowering of European civilizations, the ancient worlds of Greece and Rome, came into being, establishing traditions which are still with us today. It is in ancient Greece that the origins of the democratic tradition are to be found, reflected, albeit in a different form, in the Houses of Parliament. The very word democracy meant power of the people. This ideal first found expression over 2,000 years beforehand in the city-state of Athens. It has now been adopted not only by many national governments, but also by international bodies such as the United Nations, which acknowledges the sovereign equality of its members. It is the Romans, on the other hand, whom we look to for the origins of legal thought. Nearly all the nations of continental Europe have legal codes that are Roman in structure. From Greece came the spirit of scientific inquiry and the search for meaning and beauty. Her mathematicians, her philosophers such as Socrates, established principles which are still taught in schools today. Her sculptors and architects developed systems of proportion and composition which have influenced Western artists ever since, as here in the Jefferson Memorial. From Rome came the practical application of many of these ideas in statecraft, engineering, and building. Structures such as the Pont du Gard, Nîmes, combine grace and proportion with useful function. Much of our architecture, in America as well as in Europe, has been influenced by the classical style laid down over 2,000 years ago. But how and where did all these traditions take form? Looking back into the past, we can summon up images which laid the foundations of many aspects of European civilization. From the 12th century BC, the Mycenaean world was invaded and overthrown by further waves of Greek-speaking peoples from the north, moving into the area we know today as modern Greece, and from there to the coast of Asia Minor, eventually enclosing the Aegean. These peoples worshipped the great god Zeus, as the Mycenaeans had done, and many other gods, including Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Following this period of dislocation, the 8th century BC saw technical advances. Iron replaced bronze for tools and weapons. In addition, the Greeks, developing a Phoenician invention, had an alphabet which made writing more flexible. Previously used only for such things as inventories, the Greeks would now extend its use to literature, a great example being the epic poetry of Homer. This was also the age when the great vases decorated with geometric patterns were produced. The distinctive quality of Greek or Hellenic life depended on the city-state or polis. Greece has a number of small coastal plains ringed with mountains. Here, a community might grow in relative isolation from its neighbors. This helped to form natural political units, often very small, drawn together from the original farming communities, with Athens becoming the largest of the city-states. The 8th century BC also saw the beginning of 200 years of colonial expansion, encouraged by political disputes and a desire for more land and increased trade. Trade being facilitated by the emergence of coinage, developed in Lydia in the early 7th century BC. Greek colonists from many city-states fanned out in ever-widening circles to the Black Sea and Thrace in the east, to Sicily, southern Italy, France and Spain in the west. Although not colonies in the modern sense, but independent agricultural settlements, This epoch-making movement changed the face of the Mediterranean. The Eastern Aegean became the meeting point for new cultural forces from Syria, Mesopotamia, and even India. The 5th and 4th centuries BC saw an unparalleled flowering of culture, especially in Athens, this small community producing dramatists such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. Euripides alone is reputed to have written 92 plays, many of which can still be read and performed today. It was also the era of the historians, Thucydides and Herodotus, of Demosthenes and Pericles, the political orators, and of the philosophical giants Plato and Aristotle. Temples were rebuilt, and in 447 BC, work began on the Parthenon. When completed, its 50 massive columns supported a continuous frieze 525 feet long, 335 feet of which can still be admired by 20th century visitors. The Acropolis in the center of Athens was adorned with a mass of exquisite buildings. In addition, this era also saw the beginnings of scientific philosophy. The Babylonians had recorded eclipses, but the Greeks asked why they happened. The Egyptians had used geometry for measurement, but the Greeks developed Pythagoras' theorem. Rather than taking things at face value, the Greek thinkers set out to explore the logic behind them. The sophistication of Greek culture is also reflected in their famous black and red figure pottery. This found a ready market all over the Greek trading area and has been found as far afield as India, Central Russia, and southwest Germany. However, these achievements were not the product of a problem-free society. The threat posed by the conflict between rich and poor and slave revolt increased with the introduction of commercial agriculture and large estates. The small farmers were ruined and landless peasants fled to the cities, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. In Sparta, the fear of rebellion by the oppressed slaves weighed heavily, virtually turning it into a military camp. Sparta upheld the virtues of hard living, austerity, and discipline at the expense of art and culture. On the other hand, in Athens, it was decided to take the people into partnership. Athens now became a democracy, the first democracy in history. By our standards, it was a limited democracy. Below the citizens who enjoyed political rights were others, women, aliens, and slaves, who, along with children, made up over 2/3 of the population. All power lay with the assembly, and any citizen might attend, speak, and vote. An executive council of 500 serving in committees of 50 for a 10th of the year was chosen by lot or chance, and chairmanship rotated. Only military commanders were elected, and then only for 1 year at a time. Virtually all other magistrates or ministers were chosen by lot. At the end of the year, they had to satisfy the scrutiny of the people's courts. The famous Athenian politician Pericles described it thus: "Our constitution is named a democracy because power is held by the majority, not a minority. But our laws ensure equal treatment for all in private disputes." However, Athenian democracy was a fragile plant, with the old reactionary forces always waiting, ready to regain their privileges. In addition, the world of the city-states was inherently unstable. Athens had its allies, but its wealth and power also aroused hostility. At the beginning of the 5th century BC, Sparta and Athens united to repel an invasion from the great Persian Empire. They succeeded, defeating Persia at the battles of Marathon and Salamis. The naval battle of Salamis in 480 BC was a hard-fought victory, and as Aeschylus described it, no beach nor reef but was with corpses strewn. However, By the end of the century, Sparta and Athens were fighting one another in a bitter and bloody power struggle. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted 27 years. The Greek world was weakened, leaving the way open for another aggressor, the semi-barbarous Macedonian kingdom on the northern confines of Greece. The unity the Greek city-states could not find for themselves was forced upon them by Philip of Macedon in 338 BC, and his son, Alexander the Great, completed his work. The great days of Greece were over. With Alexander, we pass from the Hellenic to the Hellenistic age. Alexander was a military genius. Under his leadership, Macedon briefly became a world power. He flung back the frontiers of the Greek world, founding cities as he went. He crossed from Europe with his army and swept across Asia Minor, down into North Africa, back around through Mesopotamia towards the Persian Gulf. He overwhelmed the Persian Empire and continued far to the east, past Samarkand and Bukhara, nearly reaching Tashkent. He then crossed the Hindu Kush into India. But his troops had had enough, and they turned back towards Babylon, where he died, aged only 32. He had covered 12,000 miles in 10 years, fighting all the way, and his empire stretched from Greece to the borders of India. After Alexander's death, his empire quickly fragmented into three main areas: the small kingdom of Macedon, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the kingdom of the Seleucids. But what Alexander did do was to extend Greek civilization far to the east. Trade flourished as never before, but the old world of the independent city-states was gone, and the local dialects merged into a common tongue, Koine, which became widely used throughout the Middle East. The Greek gods were now supplemented by Oriental religions, and the characteristic philosophies of the Hellenistic age were developed: Stoicism, Cynicism, Epicureanism. It was a new worldview, different from the exclusivity of classical Greece. Established beliefs and knowledge were thrown into doubt. There was increasing experimentation, not only in sculpture, but also in science and mathematics. It was thus the Hellenistic world and Hellenistic civilization, not classical Greece, which Rome inherited. Rome was only just emerging when Athens entered its golden age, and just asserting itself as a force to be reckoned with when Hellenistic civilization was already at its height. Originally a collection of village settlements of Latin shepherds, Rome developed into a city during the 6th century BC. She gradually united Italy under her leadership and owed her predominance above all to her disciplined military power, combined with skill and diplomacy in forming alliances and in making wide grants of her own citizenship. But in 264 BC, Rome clashed with Carthage, the great sea power in the Mediterranean with its colonies along the African coast and in Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia. The three Punic Wars, fought over the length of a century, led Rome to become a formidable naval power. Gradually, Rome extended her empire to include Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. However, in 218 BC, the Carthaginian general Hannibal led an army of 40,000 and a number of elephants over the Pyrenees from Spain into southern Gaul. From there, he crossed the Alps into Italy, inflicting a series of major defeats upon the Roman armies before being forced to withdraw. Although nearly crushed by Hannibal, Rome finally defeated the Carthaginians in Spain in 206 BC. Pathological fear of a revival of Carthage led the Romans to conquer North Africa. Further conflict led them into Greece and Asia Minor. Step by step, Rome acquired the whole eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean. In 58 BC, Julius Caesar, an ambitious and popular aristocrat, launched an attack on Gaul. Rome's frontiers eventually advancing through France to the Rhine and later to Britain, Romania, and Syria. So, by AD 180, the Roman Empire stretched from the borders of Scotland in the west to Syria in the east. There were many revolts, even though Rome, where it was in her interest to do so, liberally granted citizenship. The conquered peoples were firmly governed and defended, on the whole, by consent. Where this failed, however, retribution was harsh and thorough. Nevertheless, the Roman Empire created a vast area with a single currency and low customs barriers, in which commerce was aided by an elaborate network of roads and protected harbors. Goods came from all corners of the empire to supply the large, wealthy population of Rome. Animals for the arena came from far and wide. From Europe, bears and wild boar. From the Middle East, tigers and lions. And from North Africa, camels and leopards. Vast quantities of grain came from Egypt. Textiles and spices from Syria. Oil from Spain, marble from Asia Minor and North Africa, slaves and tin from Britain. There was also extensive trade between the various provinces within the empire. Nor did trade end at the frontiers. Contact was made with Han China, and the famous Silk Route became established, passing through Ecbatana, Samarkand, Kashgar, and reaching Lanchao and Loyang. Administering this enormous area was a massive undertaking. Roman aristocrats passed through a short series of posts to become consuls within the Senate, holding office for 1 year only. Only a consul could command an army. Ex-consuls could then go on to serve overseas as proconsuls. This system, however, set up on republican lines in the early days of the empire, proved inadequate. There was corruption, incompetence, and sporadic civil unrest. In periods of tension, ambitious generals were able to seize power for themselves, such as the dictator Julius Caesar, thus destroying the traditional republican form of government. In 31 BC, after a century or more of civil war and increasing military rule, stability was re-established by Caesar's great-nephew Augustus. Gaining the allegiance of the armies, he retained power in his own hands, allowing the civilian Senate to share with him the task of administering the empire. Nonetheless, effective power remained in the firm grip of the emperor. Augustus introduced reforms in taxation and administration, which gave the Western world a longer period of untroubled peace than at any time either before or since. Thus, the whole of North Africa, from the borders of Egypt to the Atlantic, could be policed by a single legion, only about 6,000 men. The Augustan peace was celebrated in stone by an outburst of buildings. Monuments, triumphal arches, and theaters sprang up in cities throughout the empire. The sheer scale of their building is impressive. The Baths of Diocletian in Rome covered an area of 32 acres, and its central hall was vaulted to a height of 92 feet. The Forum in Rome centered on an open meeting place with rostra for public speakers and the Comitium where the popular assembly met. Nearby were the temples of the early Roman gods Janus, Saturn, and Vesta, numerous shops, and the theaters of Pompey and Marcellus. There were also no less than 6 racecourses in Rome alone, the largest being the Circus Maximus, which could seat 140,000 spectators. The Colosseum, where gladiatorial competitions took place, could seat 50,000. Augustus himself boasted that he had provided 8 gladiatorial shows in which 10,000 men fought to the death, and 26 combats in which 3,500 beasts were slain. The Romans also excelled in the construction of aqueducts, bridges, and frontier defenses, such as Hadrian's Wall, which stretches 73 miles across northern England, from the Tyne to the Solway Firth. As the provinces settled down in peace, the native nobility moved to the cities and spoke the Latin language. Temples and great country houses were built on the Roman model, as here at Lullingston in Kent, with elaborate baths, central heating, mosaics, and painted decoration. Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved almost in their entirety when overwhelmed by volcanic ash from the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79, provide a fascinating glimpse of life in a small city in the Roman Empire. Here at Herculaneum, there are many examples of the traditional Roman private house, the rooms arranged around an open square courtyard or garden. Well-to-do merchants or patricians would have lived in such houses, their wealth reflected by the profusion of mosaics and painted decoration. The paved streets, complete with drainage gutters, were lined with shops, interspersed with public buildings such as baths and temples. In many ways, the Romans derived their art and architecture from Greece, preserving and extending them. Many famous Roman marble statues are in fact copies of lost Greek bronze originals, although the Romans did develop their own highly naturalistic style of portraiture. The Augustan age was also celebrated in the poetry of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. Much of Roman civilization has perished with time, and today we can only piece together a vision of the classical world from those fragments which have survived. But the legacy of Rome is found not only in the form of ruins, monuments, and traces of Roman roads. There is a more lasting legacy reflected in the spoken word. Latin left a permanent imprint on the languages of France, Spain, Italy, and Romania. Modern English, too, is littered with words derived from Latin. Indeed, preserved by the Roman Church, and until very recently still used in all Roman Catholic services, Latin was to become an accepted international language in science, medicine, and law. Furthermore, Roman law remains at the root of many of the modern legal systems of the Western world. So how do the classical civilizations speak to us down through the centuries? The Greeks inspired the questing spirit in the sciences and the arts, and the Athenian spirit of democracy lives on. The Romans have found their emulators not only in the great empire builders such as Charlemagne and Napoleon, but also in the liberal thinkers of the French and American revolutions. But for the other great influence of the ancient world, we must look beyond Greece and Rome to Asia, the birthplace of the great world religions.